Hello and welcome to a new module number 1. The project for this module is called Today's Code. Every app starts with an idea, what I would call a vague statement, something that is not very well defined. You're sitting with your friend and you're thinking, wouldn't it be nice to have an app that does this? This become the initial point. If you decide to pursue that idea and actually make an app happen, this is the very first point. So in our project, the very first point, that statement, that idea, that vague uh, problem is to create an app that displays a code, a motivational code actually. On Blackboard at the University of Cincinnati, you can see the full description of the project. If you are watching this for your own knowledge, this is something that you start with. So this is our first app. The question is, how can we go from a statement like this to actually developing an app that works, that you can take to the store, and that you can benefit yourself and your community from? The process to go from that statement to a fully functional app is what I would call the app development process. You may not find much about that. This is something that I put together. There are so many different processes and software development process and different things. So if you're reading around, you may find different aspects that are closely resembles this. These particular steps is something that I borrowed from creative problem solving process by Min Ambassador, as well as the iterative software development life cycle, and I put them together to introduce you to that app development process. There are 3 steps in the app development process. Step number 1 is to define the problem, so I would call it problem formulation. Step number 2 is to define the solution, so I will call it solution formulation. And step number 3 is actually to get it done, so I will call it solution implementation. Those 3 steps, they work together in an iterative manner to create the iterative app development process. In an iterative process, all 3 steps are repeated to take the app from one phase to the other until the full app is developed. In this module 1 and the next 4 modules, we will see and actually practice going through those 3 steps. So let's start with our app that develops codes, that displays codes. So let's go with step number 1. So here I am in the first iteration. So this will be called iteration 1. I usually call it, this is the planning iteration, because when you first take actual steps, you are in fact initiating the app development process, and you initiate that process through that iteration. So this is in fact iteration number 1, the initiation of the app development process. So within that iteration number 1, we apply the 3 steps. Then we move on to iteration number 2 and apply the 3 steps. Then we move on to iteration number 3 and apply the 3 steps, and so on and so forth, depending on the planning. How many iterations will it take us to develop this app? That's what we discuss and think about in that planning iteration. And it may change, it may evolve. Usually you will go for something like 5 to 7 iterations, maybe more, maybe less, depending on the complexity of the app, on your experience, as well as the time available to you. In our case here, this is your very first application, so you'll see we're gonna kind of elongate the iterations longer, take them slowly, And so we may have so many different iterations, and each iteration may be, or you may think, if you have some experience, this is oversimplification. But if this is your first time developing an app, you hopefully find the peers corresponding to your interest and your progress. This is the app development process. It is a design process. Why am I saying this? By virtue of being a design process, this is relative to the designer, the person who will develop it. Meaning that I may look at a problem, a statement like this, and apply the app development process and come up with certain iterations and steps and a solution that will be different from you. So as you follow me, I want you to follow me in the beginning, is in those 5 modules, because that's your training and your practice. But I want you to keep in mind that you may make decisions different than the ones I make. You may design the iterations, the solution, different than I make, and this is good. This is okay. There is not a single app for each single problem. There's actually many apps that can come out of one single problem, and that's the beauty of the design process. So each one of us have the opportunity to inject our own thinking, our own interest, our own taste, even sometime, to make this app appealing and beneficial to the users who will be using it. So keeping that in mind, let's jump in and apply the 3-step app development process on that initial statement. Again, this is iteration number 1, the planning iteration. So then step number 1, and I'm gonna say this is step number 1 for iteration 1. So I will call it 1.1, problem formulation. And in the problem formulation, we define the problem. That's the objective, is to define the scope of the app that we will develop and how we will test it. So 2 main steps, and we'll introduce a 3rd step later on. The scope. What is the scope of the app? And the other is the testing scenarios. What scenarios should we follow in order to test the final product? So before we go into development and building a solution, actually, as many of you are beginners, you don't know anything about app development. We need to understand what is it that we are developing, and if fortunately we finally end up with an app, how would we know that this app actually meets that scope that we are developing? So the scope of the app we have an app to display a motivational quote, is 2 parts. The first part is to display a motivational quote from a list of quotes, and to allow the user to browse it. So I may add it here to one statement, or I can maybe make it a bullet list so we can see there are 2 parts for our scope. The user browse the different codes. So how would we test this? So we can start with testing scenario number 1. Testing scenario 1 for the first part of the scope, and we'll say that open the app and observe that a code is being displayed. Close the app and open it again, and observe that a code is being displayed. Another scenario is to the user browse the app. How would the user browse the app? I don't know yet. Maybe they will click on a button, maybe they will swipe, I don't know yet. That's part of the solution. So I will just say the user browse the app and observes a different code being displayed. Sometimes if you have experience or a more defined requirement, you will be able to know exactly or have a specific requirement or specifications to what exactly you want how exactly you want the user to browse or to interact. In some instances, if you're doing this for a client, the client will tell you, I want the user to click on a particular button and I want the button to be of this size, or I want the user to perform this particular action, and give you more definitions. So here I define the problem, and then I move to step number 1 in iteration 1, and I will be the solution formulation. The solution formulation comes in 3 steps. The first step is the model. The second is the view, and the third is the controller. In fact, in formulating the solution, we follow the model view controller design pattern. This is a common and famous design pattern in software development. The model represents the data, what data the app needs, and how to represent the data in the software in the app environment. The view represents what the user will see and how the user will interact with the app. And the controller represents how the app, or what actions the user, what actions will trigger the app and how the app will respond. Model representing the data, view representing the user interface, and controller representing the logic or the thinking or the brain or the intelligence of the app and how the app responds. So let's think about our quote app. So the first thing is the model, what data the app needs. So it's a quote app, so the app needs a quote. So the first one is the quote. Quote like what? Like, for instance, begin with the end in mind. A famous quote for Stephen Covey, part of the 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. Begin with the end in mind. So that's an example of a quote. So quote, and an example of a quote is begin with the end in mind. And you may think of many other quotes. The actual data is what I included here between parentheses. That's an actual data. That text data statement is data. Look at my sentence. I am typing different things, but this is not data for the app. Only the quote is data, and we call that constant or literal. So once you identify the data in our physical world that we want the app to recognize, the second step is how do we represent this data in the app environment. And I will leave that to the second iteration to think about, because we need to talk more about the app development environment. But the quote is not the only thing that the app wants. Notice in the scope there is list of quotes or different quotes. So it means there's more than one quote. So another data that the app needs is list of quotes. So the list itself, or the collection of quotes, that's another data element. Even though that collection is made out of individual items, each one of them is a quote, like begin with the end in mind, like stand up after you fall, like life is good, or there are so many different quotes that you can research, or maybe that you can list if you give yourself the opportunity. Each individual item is a quote. Collectively, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 100 of them, they are a collection of quotes. The collection itself is a data item. So that's the second model. Again, I will leave the representing the data. Why do I leave the representing data? One of the important things to understand about iterative process is it recognizes that your knowledge of both the technology and the problem will evolve through that process. Meaning that As we go through those iterations and try to answer the questions of the app development process, answer as much as you know. If you do not know, move on and let the process and trust that the process will lead you to the answer that you are looking for. So at this time, I don't know about app environment. So I don't know how to represent the code, how to represent the list of codes in the app. So I'll leave it and move on and trust that the iterative process will allow us to do this, to reach the end. The view represents the user interface, what the user will see, and how the user will interact with the app. So at this time, the user should see text representing the code, like the begin with the end in mind. Let me introduce you to something. The user interface in the app is made of components. In order for the user to see something, you have to have a component that represents that. So to represent a text, we need a component called label. The iOS platform provides a component called UI label. UI stands for user interface, to represent a text. So that's a piece of information I'm providing to you. As we go through, I will provide you with some pieces of information. You're gonna learn by reading, by researching, and by experimenting. A user interface component is a component provided by the platform and is being used. So we're gonna use a UI label in order to represent that text. And the user will not interact with that label, but in order for the user to browse, which is the second part of the code, we will give the user a button. The user will click on a button to browse different codes. Why did I choose to represent these two? Because many of you have used apps before. You interacted with the app and you use the web and many software. So the concept of a label that display text, a button, is not a new concept to you. You have used it before. Now you are developing it. The component that represents a button is called UI button. So the app can use the UI button to allow the user to browse. So in the controller, the app, there are two actions. The first action is when the app loads. So when the app loads the first time, that's an action because it's a verb. The action is a verb. And when the user clicks the button, that's another action. The first action is an internal action for the app. When the app loads, it's an action that is provided by the operating system. The second action button is an action provided by the user. So when the app loads, what do we want to happen? How the app will respond? The app should display a code. The app should display a code. When the user clicks a button, the app should display a code. So the app should be displaying different codes. And how could these be different? Maybe we can add here a random code. So the randomization will allow the app to make it different. How would the app do that? How do we build those functionalities? How do we identify those actions? We'll leave those to future iterations. So we move on to step number 3, solution implementation. In this first iteration 1, our purpose is to plan. So the implementation represents the steps we need to follow to implement the project or the app. So in that first step, those steps will be our iteration plan. So we say iteration 1, plan the app. Iteration 2 will be to set up the project using Xcode. And then in iteration 3, I will develop an app that displays a single code. So I said, well, forget about the list of codes. So the way what I did here is break down the scope into smaller sets. So I'm not thinking about the entire scope. I'm only thinking about a very specific scope. And then iteration 4, develop an app that displays or display, maybe not because I already have an app, display a single code that displays a code from a list. And then in iteration 5, maybe we can add the randomization. Let the app display a random code from the list. And then in iteration 6, the user clicks a button to browse the codes. So I identified 6 iterations that I need to go through in order to accomplish that goal of developing an app that has that scope. So that concludes iteration number 1, and then we move on to iteration 2, which is project setup. So iteration 1 was planning, iteration 2 project setup, and we'll do that in another video.